Hello everyone, it's Mark with High Tech Tutorials, and in last week's episode we used the playground to mock up our model. We created a server response model that had several sub keys or sub boxes that contain, like, for example, our playlist item that then had an ID and a snippet. Snippet then had title, description, thumbnails, so on and so forth. And we used the following flowchart here to somewhat give an example of that, to see that, okay, we have a box of we have items which we can consider our videos that have several playlist items, or this represents one video. That video has an ID and a snippet. That snippet then has title, description, thumbnails. Thumbnails then have a certain resolution. In this case, we're using standard. And for standard, they have a URL associated, which gives us the URL to download the image in question. So that's where we left off last episode. And in part 2 of this same thing, we're going to pick up by cleaning up this particular piece of code here. So what I particularly don't like about this is every time I need to access a URL, I have to jump through like all of these hoops, when in reality, all I really want is just to be able to say print the item.url, because that's the data we want. We don't care about it's in thumbnails and it's standard. This is the end result. So what we're going to do today is clean up our model structure to give us a much easier to use API when we get ready to bring this into our app, so that we can have this result where we have our image, we have our title, and our publish date. So with that being said, first things first is we're going to remind ourselves of the different boxes that we have here. And based on our structure here is the same way we're actually going to structure our updated model. So what we're first going to do is we're actually going to keep this top level, because if we go back to our JSON here, we know that when we first parse or hit this endpoint, we have this items key that has an array of all of our items or our videos, and we grab our information from there. So with that being said, we're still going to want to have this top level that represents an item of playlist items. But what we are going to do is we're going to kind of get rid of these bottom level objects and create one master struct, like our playlist item, that's actually going to be the struct that represents our actual data, instead of having like multiple structs. And so there's a much easier way to do this, but it is a bit more advanced way of using Decodable, where you actually have to construct your own decoder. So you have to essentially tell it, well, if you want to be able to create your own custom keys, how should I parse this? Like, what keys should I use to be able to tell this structure? And so that's what we'll do next here. So in order to do that, first things first is we're going to come into this struct. Let me, for now, I'll just comment this code out, which is going to create some other errors down here, but we'll deal with that stuff later. So now that we have a playlist item, here we're actually going to construct, what do we really want our struct to look like? Well, we know we're going to want an ID. Instead of having a snippet, what we're going to say is, we know one of the things we want is going to be a title, right? And we know that title is going to be a string. What does that title look like? That title is just going to be this right here. That's just this title here. So what's another property we want? We know that eventually when we click into one of these, there's an associated description that has some text here, such as Swift News, so on and so forth. So we know we want a description. All right. So now that we have our description, what else do we want? Well, we know we have an image and we want some sort of image URL. So let's go ahead and create that one. Yeah, let's go with it. Yeah, we'll do it this way. And we're going to say that's going to be of type URL. All right, so now that we have that, what else do we want? Well, we know we want the date. So let's go ahead and add that one. And we're actually just going to call this one published date to make it a little clearer as to what it is that we're looking for. And we're going to use a string with it for now. And another thing that we're going to need is when we click on this video, in order for us to play the video the way we are here, we have to provide the ID of that video so that we can actually go fetch that from YouTube so we can play it. So in order to do that, we're going to add another property down here called video ID. And with that being said, we're going to use a string for that. And this essentially is going to represent the playlist model item or the model object that we're going to use to essentially display all of this data in our app. Much more precise, much more direct. So now we'll be able to, with this alone, we should be able to do things like, for example, if I were to just create a playlist item here, I'll be able to say, and let's just call this an item for the sake of example. I'll be able to say things like print the item dot title or print the item dot description, so on and so forth. That's what we're after. We want to be able to use it that way. So this alone is not good enough for us to do what we need to do. In order to make this work, what we're going to have to do is create what are called coding keys in order to essentially tell Decodable, hey, since we're no longer giving you the exact structure, I'm going to provide to you the keys that we're later going to use to say, here is the key that you need to find when you're parsing this structure down here. When you get this JSON, here's the key that you need to find. And then I'm going to give you the structure of that key, what the values are for you to be able to give me the data I want back. So first things first is we're going to create a custom initializer that is going to take some sort of decoder, and that's going to throw. It's going to throw some errors. So with this being said, once we have this init here, the second part we're going to want to do is set up essentially our coding keys. Now, what I want to do is we're going to use the same kind of, we're going to use this chart here to really help decide what our keys are going to be. So the first thing that I want to start off with is this particular box here. We're going to call this our item coding keys, right? Because in any given item, here are the two keys associated with this item. So what I'm going to come here is create a private enum called item coding keys. That's going to have, the keys are going to be of type string, and they need to also conform to this coding key protocol here. And all we have to do here is essentially provide the cases like case snippet and case ID. And what that ID and snippet in this particular case need to match the key as it's represented in the JSON coming down. Now, let's say for whatever reason, this key was just like something completely odd and we wanted to work with it differently. We could provide an actual string value for all of these so that the coding key knows essentially how to parse this. But in this particular case, by default, since our cases match up directly, we don't have to do this. Because the reason we would need to do this is if we wanted to call this like snip, we could still use case snip and it would know that anywhere where you see case snip, that represents this particular string key. But we don't need that for now. We'll just use the exact keys. We will have one case where we change this, but we'll see that later. So with that being said, that gives us our item coding keys, and that is going to be enough for us to get our snippet. But once we get our snippet alone is its own box, and it has its own keys. It has a publish that key, a channel ID, a title, description, and thumbnail keys. So what we're going to do is now create another enum, and we're going to call this our snippet coding keys. And we're going to say these keys are our type string, and we're going to conform to coding key. And based on that, now we can set up our different cases for snippet. Well, what does a snippet have that we want? Snippet has a title, it has description, it has thumbnails, it also has published date. That's the key that we want. Now in this particular case, snippet doesn't actually have a published date, but it has published at. So here's a perfect example where what we're going to say is we want to represent the key for published at as published date. And the way we're going to say is its value, when you go to parse this, is actually called published at. But we're going to use key published date for that. And it'll make more sense later on when we get further down. So now we're going to come down here and we're going to say the other case that we're going to need in this case is going to be what we call our resource ID, because that's where our video ID is going to exist. But this is still within the box of snippet. This is still within the snippet object. So we're going to say we have a case called resource ID, and we're going to leave that as is because we're using the exact string. We don't need to provide an additional string for that. Cool. So now that we have that, let's keep going down with our next box. Now, just as example, these keys match everything we have here. It's title, description, thumbnails, published at, resource ID. That are those keys here. Cool. Let's go to our next one. The next box we have is thumbnails. That has a key of standard. No problem. Let's do a private enum, and we'll call this thumbnails coding keys. Keys are strings. And this is going to have a case of standard. Cool. Well, standard is its own box as well that has a key of URL. So what we're going to want to do is create another one. Private enum, and we'll call this standard coding keys. And in this case, we're going to want to map this to, we don't want to use URL because URL is just kind of whatever. We're going to actually use image URL this way. And we're just like we did with the publish date, we're going to say the actual key for this is URL, but we're going to represent it in our code as image URL. But this is the actual key in the code. How do I know that's the actual key? Because if I come down here into my code and look at the standard, the key is URL this way. Cool. Going back to this, we have one more that we haven't done, and that's for the resource ID. So let's say private enum of resource ID coding keys. And it looks like I made a boo-boo here. Change that. And we're going to call this case our video ID. And we get that from here. Video ID. Cool. With that being said, we essentially have everything we need now to be able to represent and tell our custom decoder how it needs to parse this data. So first things first is we need to create our, what I would call like our root container or our overall container that contains everything. So we'll say let container equal try the decoder that we're using here. And we're going to use this particular option here, which is a container keyed by what key. And we see that it throws, which is the reason why we add this try here to be able to catch the error. And if we use container keyed by, all we need to do is tell it here for this particular container, which coding keys represent the data for that container. Well, our master root or our top level container is essentially going to have these item coding keys. So here we just have to come and say item coding keys dot self. And this represents our root container. So what we want to be able to do now is say, okay, well, now that we know we're using these keys, I want to set the value for our actual property up here. So our property ID, I can actually come up here and say self.id to represent our actual playlist item ID, not our keys. We haven't used these yet, but self.id. How am I going to get the ID? What's the ID represented by? Well, if you go to our container, which is our top level container here, what I'm going to want to say here is I want to decode a string, because we know that it's going to be a string. We already said that the ID coming here is a string, and we validated that the ID, the way it's set up here, is a string. And we're going to say, try to decode this particular string for the key of .id. So look for this case, look for the key ID. What is the key ID? The case that we represent here. What does this represent? This represents this key here. Look for that key, and whatever you find, decode that as a string and store that into my ID property. And that's how we get our ID. So it's a bit of extra work, but this is what you have to do if you want to be able to have define your own custom properties and be able to use that without having to create multiple structs and manage those. So let's go to our next property. Let's say, for example, now we want to be able to grab our snippet. So here's our snippet here. But we see that our snippet itself is one level deeper than our ID is just a value. But our snippet is not necessarily a value per se, but it itself is a container. And then within our snippet, it contains the values we want. So what we're going to want to do is create another container here. I'll just give us some space so it can be clear. And we're going to call this, let's say, let our snippet container equal, try to use our container, and we're going to call .nested container. And what is this container keyed by? It's keyed by our snippet coding keys .self. And what is the key that's represented for this particular snippet coding key? Well, our .snippet. Because we're using the container, our container has item coding keys. Item coding keys has a snippet. And so we're saying, hey, and once again, if you get confused by this, just think of this box here. We say our item coding keys has an ID, and then our snippet is its own box. So we have to represent that not as a value, but as another container itself that has keys. What are these keys represented by? Our snippet coding keys. What are our snippet coding keys? Title, description, thumbnails, publish date, resource ID. Cool. So now that we have that set and we've set what our snippet, we can now actually start storing the properties associated with that. So now let's say one of the ones in our snippet is a title. Well, how the heck do we get our title? Let's say here self.title is going to equal, and let's try our snippet container, because now at this point we're working within the snippet box, right? How do we know it's our snippet box? Because up here we set it up. We said our snippet box is a nested container of our container. It's one level deeper. So snippet container, and what we're going to want to tell snippet container is to decode, and we'll use a string. Decode this as a string for what key? Well, if I hit dot here, I have a nice, easy to work with API of all the keys associated with this. Which one do we want? We want our title. Go into our snippet container that's keyed by these snippet coding keys. And for the key title, decode it as a string and store it in title. Let's try our next value. Let's say our description. How are we going to get that? Well, we're going to try our snippet container again. We're going to say decode as a string for our description. And it's literally that simple, going all the way down. Same thing with our publish date. publish date. What is that going to equal? Try our snippet container dot decode, in this case as a string as well, for publish date. Cool. Now that essentially covers both our ID and our title, description, publish date. So far we did ID, title, description, publish date. Now we just need our image URL and our video ID. So let's keep working on, let's work on our image URL. Now our image URL is yet in another box, right? So within snippet container, it has thumbnails, and thumbnails has its own box. So thumbnails, this thumbnails box is a nested container from our snippet container. See how that goes one level deep? Let me say that one more time. Our thumbnails exist within our snippet container, and it itself, what we really want is the standard, and this is actually yet a container within a container. So it's kind of like this nested tree of things. So let's create what we're going to call our thumbnails container. And thumbnails container is going to try, and we're going to say, go to our snippet container and go another level deeper in another nested container from our snippet container. That hopefully that makes sense. And what is this going to be keyed by? Well, it's going to be keyed by our thumbnails coding keys, right? Thumbnails coding keys. So we can come here and say thumbnails coding keys. And for which key? Well, in this particular case, it's going to be for key thumbnails. So from now that we have our thumbnails container, we're in the thumbnails box. What the heck does the thumbnails box look like again? It looks like this. Thumbnails, and then it has default, medium, standard. So it looks like we're going to have to go yet another level deeper and create another level container. So from here, let's create a standard container. And I know this kind of seems like really odd at the point because it seems very much like the structs that we created before. But the difference is all of this is contained within our initializer, and it's kind of hidden logic where we're not managing a bunch of different structs. We're just getting the properties we want and just dealing with that. So, and we're letting the decoder do all of the magic for us. So standard container equals, what we're going to want to do here is say, go take the thumbnails container and go one level deeper again as a nested container. That's going to be keyed by standard coding keys for key dot standard. And the journey continues. But now that we've finally gotten to our standard part, right? We're now in the point where we're at this level. We're at our standard. We finally have access to our URL. So what we can finally do now is say self.image URL. And what that's going to equal is our standard container dot decode. And what we're going to decode in this particular case is a URL for key image URL. Just like that, nicely, strongly typed. We don't have to worry about entering strings. We have cases that we've already defined for all of this. Really cool way to do it. And the last level that we have is our resource ID. So let's knock that out real quick. So here what we're going to want to do is we need to get actually go into yet another container, because if we go into our code here, let's scroll down, we can see that our resource ID is yet another container, but this particular container is in our snippet container. And I know it's kind of hard to see from here, but I can promise you it's there. Plus we can look at here and see that our resource ID, right? Our resource ID is a container, but it is a nested container from our snippet container. Cool. So now that we're armed with that information, let's say our resource container is going to equal try our snippet container. And we're going to look for another nested container keyed by resource coding keys for key resource ID. And now once we have that and we have our resource container, we can just grab our video ID. So let's come here and say self.videoid equals try our resource container dot decode, and we're going to decode this as a string for our video ID. And that's it. That's literally all we need to be able to now decode this in a nice, we have all of our essentially decoding logic here to just go ahead and decode these things. And it makes it so much easier because now we won't have to deal with this sort of thing anymore, right? This no longer works because it's like it doesn't know what the item doesn't have a property called snippet. We got rid of that. Item only has an ID, a title, a description, an image URL, and it has the data we care about. So now if we wanted to print out the URL, we literally can all we have to do is say print an item dot image URL. And that's it. We come and play and we have our URLs here. Well, what about the title? Okay, let's print the image.title. Nice and easy. Nothing else had to change because we're still decoding our top level server response. That server response then know that it has items. Why? Because up here, server response has items. That is an array of playlist items. And then playlist items knows how it needs to be decoded because down here we've given it custom coding keys. And in addition to that, we've kind of essentially worked through our containers, nested containers, to eventually come to what we now are able to easily parse our information. So this video has gone a little bit long. So in the next episode, we'll actually take this data and start, we'll copy out everything from this playground and we'll actually add it to our app so that we can actually start loading and seeing the data because now we have our data model set. Everything's ready to go now. We can, and that's evident by the fact that I can come down here and I have access to any item that I want, any property from that item. If I want to print the item.publish date and run that, I have access to all of my items and all of the information associated with that. So I'm ready to update my UI, but we're already pretty deep into this video. So I'm going to cut it here and we will pick up in the next episode, actually putting all of the data that we've just downloaded so that we can actually start displaying it in our app. Please rate or not rate, please like and subscribe to the video and I will see you in the next one.